Okay, so we had delved into some examples of tensions are emerging and disagreements emerging within uh, uh, kind of more, again, homogenous like communities. What we'll do now is to refocus attention on um, tensions and the difference of experiences occurring between different communities. But we're coexisting largely alongside one another. So, somewhat similar to the tensions found within the Massachusetts Bay Colony through the experiences of things like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, and the Old versus New Salem as well. Between 1640 and the year 1700, the population of the English colonies grew from a mere 26,000 people to approximately 251,000, a sixfold, or excuse me, a tenfold increase in about 60 years. That kind of demographic shift and the arrival of that influx of population is going to have transformative consequences, and it's going to lead to tensions as well as new social conundrums. I mean, one motivating factor, if not the motivating factor, for many Europeans coming to the New World is that these individuals, these people, wanted to um, become and take advantage of a new social order and a new hierarchy. But they wanted to be a part of the hierarchy. They didn't want to just simply move laterally across the social ladder. They came to the New World largely to become part of a landowning class that they thought was the key to social and economic advancement, to generate wealth for themselves and amass wealth for themselves. So these European standards and notions of social status, all predicated on land ownership, meant that they wanted to be a part of that hierarchy. Um, that in the old world in Europe, land was already largely determined and had already been largely carved up and remained in the hands of an elite landowning class. So if you were born into a social um, portion of the social ladder, socioeconomic ladder, where you did not own land, then there was little chance that you would ever own land. And so as a result, your chances of kind of being able to improve your station in life, your standard of living, were pretty marginal in many cases. At the same time, however, Europe was experiencing a period of population growth, that it was beginning to rebound from the Black Death, and so cities became overcrowded. Employment opportunities began to become more scarce, and as a result, the New World held kind of an alluring kind of prospect of success. It was getting to this land of opportunity, however, that was a problem. Many couldn't afford the expense of the trip, and so this developed a need for beginning to promote what's known as indentured servitude. This is another effort to try and solve the arithmetic surrounding y- labor and labor shortages in the colonial world. You'll remember that many English people sought a new start in the New World, but they couldn't pay for that transit. Indentured servitude looked to solve that problem. And the terms for indentured servitude included roughly the following: that an individual in the New World who was already, a colonist, would pay the way for someone in Europe to make their way to the New World, and in return, that newcomer would work for his or her sponsor in order to pay off. the expense of the transit, and pay off that debt. The terms of service lasted anywhere from, say, 4 to 7 years, or until the person, the newcomer, turned 21 years old. As an indentured servant, an individual could be bought or sold, that they were completely subservient to his or her master. And this was a servant master relationship. The master was to provide clothing, food, and shelter, sometimes even an education. Um, Within certain colonies, specifically Virginia and Maryland, indentured servants were initially treated very poorly, and there were reports of kind of outrageous abuse that took place. Um, but when the terms of service expired, masters were to provide servants with a set of essentials: clothing, food, maybe some money, in order to get that now freed servant started on their own. So this was a temporary kind of contractual agreement. Um, so it solved, on the one hand, kind of the short-term need for labor, and kind of solved the chronic need for, resolving and meeting labor needs. Second, it promoted newcomers to come to, and new opportunities for newcomers to come to the colonies, to kind of, again, attract people to particular um, centers, or particular regions of the colonies themselves, choosing one colony over another, say. Uh, so there were a couple uh, caveats, or benefits, that were attractive to some, either, colonists that were already here that needed workers, or to those looking to come to the New World but couldn't afford to. But again, this was, you know, a limited term of service. Um, there was also the institution of slavery that was alive and well, not only in the English colonies, as we talked, but also more broadly throughout the New World itself. Um, in England, an advancing economy, that is to say, a more complex economic system, um, began to um, uh, make the institution of slavery. It began to create conditions in which England was becoming less dependent on the institution within England itself. Now, that's not to say that there weren't any slaves in England. There were, and the institution of slavery, uh, legalized slavery, continued well into the 19th century in the English experience. But by the 1620s, slavery and bondage, as it was known, was still technically legal. But because the economy was basically pivoting towards more manufacturing jobs, um, and they were relying on the colonies to provide the raw materials to fuel the economic base, or the manufacturing base of England itself in the English experience. This meant that, that type of ad- um, uh, I mean, advanced economic activity is one way to put it. Is Means that you are beginning to create conditions, economic conditions, that are going to begin to create a increasing amount of distance and dependence on, um, distance from and dependence on slavery. But because this manufacturing base in England was dependent on raw materials coming from the New World, meant that slavery was going to be a necessary institution in the New World itself, whether it was on sugar plantations in the Caribbean region, or whether it was on growing cotton, or any type of labor-intensive industry within the. Again, we're focusing primarily on the English sphere of influence here, to begin to use slave labor in order to meet the immediate needs. So slavery in the mid-Atlantic colonies, basically, again, roughly this geographic area, Maryland, Virginia, and elsewhere. And it should be noted that slavery existed in everywhere along the eastern seaboard in the English zones of control. Um, the earliest record we have of African slaves appearing in the English colonies dates to 1619, when they arrived in Jamestown. Again, the English saw slavery as a New World necessity, an economic instrument to, again, solve labor shortages. But over time, the justification for this institution and practicing this institution, coming amidst a land of moral purpose and optimism. Basically, this idea of American exceptionalism, as expressed in some place like the Massachusetts Bay Colony, began to revolve around a question along these lines of how could people claiming to represent the last best hope for creating a utopian society claim to uphold slavery. And so, as a result, people began to craft a number of responses to that very question. In some cases, people turned towards cultural values. For example, colonists interpreted slavery as a punishment for a crime, um, or being the result of captivity and war. Puritans themselves saw sloth as a sin, and that everyone needed to work for the good of the community, whether that was as a slave or as an indentured servant or as a free individual. They also saw the institution of slavery as a way of maintaining order within society. That it's very regimented. It's very clear as far as the power structure with regard to a social application is concerned. Other times, and other arguments included that this was necessary for differentiating civilized from the savage. From that Indians or Native Americans and Africans were not Christians, and so therefore, it would be frowned upon for Christians to enslave other Christians. But we're talking about, or in their opinion, they saw this as a Christian versus non-Christian um, uh, paradigm. These were the kinds of arguments made in order to try and legitimize the institution of slavery. And by 1640, slavery had become perpetual and hereditary in both Virginia and Maryland. That is to say, that slaves would remain slaves for their entire lives, and their children would be born into slavery as well. And yet, even when Native Americans and Africans began to convert to Christianity, they remained slaves. By the year 1700, in not only Maryland, but also in New York, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, colonies, these colonies all had laws on the books allowing slaveholders to retain their slaves, even if they were Christians. And it's at this point that some historians argue that nationality began to enter into the equation. That you have this now. It's there's this delineation along the lines of English versus non-English. Regardless, colonists continued to search for more permanent markers of distinction. And it's really in this experience, in this kind of environment, or this kind of uh, perspective, that race becomes that marker. That white becomes increasingly identified as with concepts like free, English, Christian, whereas a black was seen as slave, non-English, and sometimes heathen. These concepts were by and large New World phenomenon. I mean, geographically, as I mentioned, slaves existed throughout the English colonies during the early settlement period. Um, in England, in New England, um, in 1637, following a what's known as the Pequot War between colonists and Native Americans, a bloody conflict measured in atrocities. The English traded enslaved Native Americans for African slaves, and Puritans accepted the institution of slavery, and they practiced it. In Virginia and Maryland and the South, tobacco was a cash crop. Agriculture was, on these specifically on these large plantations that I mentioned in the earlier lecture, meant that harvesting, which is working simply the fields and the kind of engaging in the agricultural industry itself, was labor intensive, and it demanded a labor force that was mobile but not independent, a labor force that was cheap and was permanent. That is to say, not temporary. This is the reason why, in you know, usually in Maryland and points south, um, s- the use of African slaves was depended on more heavily, rather than something like indentured servitude, in which you have this constant churn taking place because the terms of service would expire. Also, within um, agricultural societies, we're talking largely about non-skilled labor. That you don't need a great deal of skill in order to farm, and so the use of slaves was checked all these boxes as far as these kinds of uh, demands um, were expressed. So agricultural societies in particular wanted long-term help that could be manipulated in order to maximize profits. Workers without their own agendas. Large plantations again required a large, cheap labor force to work the land, as I mentioned, whereas in New England, you had farms and you had farms that used slaves, but the scale of these farms was smaller, um, that they worked smaller plots. And as a result, as you know, um, the homesteads get up and running, as their availability of more kind of modern tools becomes available and accessible as technology begins to improve. This meant that um, uh, the New England farmers, that kind of cohort, grew less and less dependent on slavery. This is one reason why, or one of the reasons or explanations for why northern societies began to grow less dependent on uh, the use and importation of African slaves, whereas the South did not. Um, that's I mean, for some that might be hair splitting as far as arguments are concerned. What's necessary to understand, however, is that the experience of enslaved Africans was the epitome of inhumanity. Slaves that were seized and taken from the slave coast, from western parts of Africa, um, they were, um, you know, put into chains. They were embarked on ships. They were transported across the Atlantic in what's called the Middle Passage. Um, it's important to understand that slaves were not passengers, they were cargo, or they were considered to be cargo. And because of that operating, mentality, this meant that it was necessary for slave ships and the crew and the captains to maximize space on the slave ships. The holds below deck were mere crawl spaces in in their construction and organization, meaning that there was only really enough room to lie down. Slaves were prone. Oftentimes, they were naked. The crew was most vulnerable to any attempted insurrection or slave revolt during this Middle Passage when the slaves themselves were brought above decks. And so, as a result, that type of movement was kept to a minimum. So, slaves spent most of the 3 month journey in poorly ventilated holds where slaves would eat, sleep, they would relieve themselves while quarantined below deck. To give you, I'll be moving between this slide and the next slide, but to give you an idea here of what we're talking about with some of these spaces, you can see here just how compact and inhumane these kinds of conditions are. You can also see, in some cases, again, for the purpose of sheer efficiency, how slaves could be arrayed, head to foot, um, in order to maximize space as well. Um, Slaves died en route as a result of things like suffocation, disease, murder, suicide. And when that happened, these individuals were simply thrown overboard, and the losses were not recorded um, as lives lost. Instead, they were recorded as weight lost, as if as kind of reinforcing the notion that they were cargo. So there's no real discernible number that we have working that we have according to the records. Um, but using the weights, we can try and discern kind of a general number with regard to the number of lives lost, which was roughly a mortality rate probably in the neighborhood of 25% or so of African slaves that lost their lives during this Middle Passage. Slaves were abused. This could be physically abused, sexually abused in some cases. Upon making it to the New World, slaves were offloaded, bathed in lard in order to make their bodies look stronger and healthier. Um, the overwhelming number of slaves, to get back to the previous slide, went to um, the Caribbean and South America. And you can kind of get a sense of the breakdown here as far as you know, the European communities, the colonists that were demanding slaves, and the kind of uh, depending on how bold these arrows are, where the bulk of the slaves were ending up. Again, Brazil for the Portuguese, but also in the British possessions in the Caribbean by and large, and also British uh, demands here in the red in North America, among others. Millions came to North America. The From 1619, with regard to North America itself, the English colonies, when slaves first began to arrive, as I mentioned in 1619, up until 1808, when the international slave trade was outlawed in the what was then the United States. Um, you have millions of enslaved individuals coming to the eastern seaboard. These individuals were culturally and linguistically illiterate when it came to their integration into and their introduction into colonial society in these English uh, colonies. It was in many respects an alien world. They also had to adapt to new a new environment as well. That they're moving again from tropical and semi-tropical zones into kind of more temperate areas in some cases, with regard specifically in the North American experience, um, which could take some adjustment. So this again was inhumane. Believe it's something along the lines of 11.5 million slaves were um, extracted, um, taken from Africa and dispersed throughout the Western Hemisphere. Again, 25% of that was lost in the Middle Passage. The remaining slaves that did survive that trip were then enslaved and distributed again throughout the Western Hemisphere as needed. In an effort to kind of understand, get a sense of experiences, I'll turn attention here towards two testimonials. Um, One was a woman named Mary who came to Virginia, the Virginia colony, as an African slave in 1622. I'll start this testimonial. I'm running out of time on this segment, but of course I'll continue it in part three. Uh, she initially arrived in the Western Hemisphere in the Caribbean region, so not directly transported from Africa the um to the Virginia colony itself. And that was pretty typical. I mean, that you would have slaves make their initial landfall in the Western Hemisphere in the Caribbean. I mean, it's not to say that they all did as far as making their way into North America, but Mary's case here was uh, not kind of rare by any means. She worked in the Chesapeake Tidewater region, very close again to the waterfront of the various river systems, but also the Chesapeake Bay area. She married a man by the name of Antonio Johnson, and together they transitioned from bound service to freedom. How and why that happened is really not well known. According to the records from which we learn of her existence and where she shows up in the public record here. Um, we do know that she had four children, all of which were raised as Christians. And by 1650, the Johnsons, the family, had an estate of over 250 acres on which they raised cattle and pigs. Eventually, they moved to Maryland, and by 1672, English law began to move to constrict Africans' access to um, experiences like Mary Johnson's. So that between 1680 and 1700, the slave population in Virginia doubled from about 3,000 to 6,000 people. And in Maryland, it grew from 8,000 to 43,000 people, where um, uh, the African American population grew from 8,000 to 43,000. From 1700 to 1740, 54,000 Africans were brought to the Chesapeake Bay region. This was now, in this case, directly from Africa itself, Biafra, and also the Angola regions of what is today Africa. So we do see a pivot here as far as not coming from the Caribbean, as in the case of Mary. For Mary's family and future generations, this relationship between race and slavery became increasingly indistinguishable. Now, masters could manumit their slaves on their own. I mean, they free their slaves, but they then had to pay the cost of removing them from the colony. Um, so, that in many cases, um, colonies they would recognize the right of slave owners to